creation of Famine Roads as ostensible relief projects in the height of the Great Hunger in 1847 remains one of the most contentious legacies from the Great Hunger, both in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. These so-called roads to nowhere are often bitterly remembered as misguided public works that exposed hunger-stricken labourers to inclement weather in desolate settings for a mere pittance to survive. Yet these bleak reminders of the Great Hunger also tend to traverse some of the most scenic landscapes and areas of outstanding natural beauty in the Republic and North of Ireland. However, they are usually very difficult to find. Mapping Famine Roads brings you on a journey to some of the most remarkable ones in existence. Our guides, Professor Eileen Murphy and Dr. Colm Donnelly of Queen's University Belfast, have recently led a community archaeological project to excavate the Famine Road in Boho, County Fermanagh, which serves now as a monument to the events of 175 years ago when it was created. Mike Murphy from the University College Cork explores the cultural, historical and social significance, along with the topographical features of Munster Famine Roads in Glenville and at the Healy Pass in County Cork. The Killery Harbour Famine Road in County Galway, Coolarta Famine Road in the Burren National Park in County Clare and Slieve Gullion Famine Wall in County Armagh are all located in especially scenic surroundings. Here, at the National Famine Museum in Strokestown in County Roscommon, we have invaluable archival material about the sighting of a famine road between Strokestown and Drumsna, Jamestown and Carrick-on-Shannon, which was never built. In her classic poem, That the Science of Cartography is Limited, Even Boland makes clear that the simple act of mapping famine roads is not nearly enough to emphasize the suffering of those who created them. She writes, "In the second winter of their ordeal in 1847, when the crop had failed twice, relief committees gave the starving Irish such roads to build. Where they died, there the road ended and ends still."
In August 2021, we undertook a one-week excavation at the site of a famine road in Drumacooran, Bow in County Fermanagh. This was the first excavation to have been undertaken at one of these poignant sites. So famine roads, they date to a very precise period between 1846 and 1847, and they were part of a government public works scheme because basically they didn't want to give the poor, starving people food for nothing. They wanted to make sure that they were earning their food. This was all tied into a public works scheme. So in Fermanagh, we know that the dates of the work scheme was October 1846 through to June 1847. So this is quite unusual for an archaeological monument, to know the precise start and end date. They are scattered all across the countryside and are scars in the landscape that people maybe notice but don't really know their story. They're called by a variety of names like the Broad Road, the Line, the Bracken Road, which means Porridge Road. And as I said, they're a direct monument related to the Great Irish Famine. So at our site, you could see a raised linear ridge in a field on the landscape. One of our colleagues, Dr. Jill Almond, undertook historical research associated with roads in County Fermanagh, and she worked out that in the area we were studying, which was the baronies of Clanawley and Maharaboy, there would have been 34 of these road schemes, about 17 in each of the baronies. So our road was located near Bowcross Roads, running up to Flush Bridge. So we wanted to excavate a section across the road, basically to see how it was constructed, because we're very fortunate that there are British parliamentary papers which give us a plan of how these roads should have been constructed. You know, this was the instruction that was given to the engineers when building these roads. So there could be roads that had sort of a width of 24 feet, so that's just over 7 metres, and then smaller roads of a width of about 21 feet, so just over 6 metres. They were to have like a little fence and a ditch at either side. The instructions say that they should have like a sort of a clay base, and then that this would be covered over with stone, and maybe the stone sort of infilled with sand or blindings, as they call them. We wanted to bring prominence to these monuments and to commemorate the 175th anniversary of the Great Famine. We undertook our excavation, so it was a crew from the Centre for Community Archaeology, local volunteers and some of our students. We spent 5 days excavating at the site. We were quite surprised in the early phases of the excavation because we went down to a very distinct clay layer. So this was like a blue clay, so it really stood out from the topsoil. We kept anticipating that as we moved either side of our kind of long thin strip that we'd find stones, but we didn't. We found no stones at all. So basically we came to the conclusion that our road wasn't finished. I mean, it ended in the middle of the field, so that was a clue that it wasn't completed, but they hadn't even got as far as putting the stone cap on the road, so it wouldn't have been functionable. One of the other things that was extremely interesting from the excavation was the fact that we found no artefacts whatsoever. So in my mind, before we started out, I was expecting, well, maybe we'll find a clay pipe. You know, as people work, they might have been smoking, or maybe there'll be bits of animal bones, you know, the sorts of typical things we would find on sites of that sort of 19th century period. But to find nothing was a really stark reminder to us that these people had nothing. And as we excavated as well, we were struck by, this would have been a really horrific place. I mean, it's a very tranquil landscape at the moment. You know, there's a babbling brook, you can hear the cows, and it's very peaceful. But when that road would have been constructed, it would have been very harrowing and probably very difficult. Again, we get the sense from the historical accounts, you know, people would have had to turn up to work at 6 a.m. They'd have had to work a full day through to 6 p.m. and maybe had an hour's break. And if you think about people who were starving, this would have been back-breaking work and difficult for even able-bodied people. There were harsh regulations. If you turned up late in the morning, after 6 a.m. you got a quarter of your pay docked. If you then turned up before 9 a.m. you got half your pay docked, and if you turned up after 9 a.m. you got no pay, and if you weren't there for the final roll call at the end of the day, you got no pay. Because workers were expendable, there were people kind of queuing up and watching, waiting for people to drop on site to replace them because people were so desperate. And we also get a sense in the local newspapers of how desperate people were. So in the Enniskillen Chronicle, we think the first person who was reported as having died on one of these road schemes was a man, James Rolston, and he was from near Irvinstown. And the report tells us that he had been working on a road scheme and then went home, and the inquest said that he died from starvation. It turns out that he was being paid 10 pence to work on a particular scheme, and this was then expected to feed himself and his family of 6. But the other information tells us that, you know, the family would have been living on turnips, but the price of turnips had been greatly inflated because people were desperate to buy them. So somebody was profiteering out of it, if you like. But the amount of turnips that his family could have afforded on his salary of 10p wouldn't have been enough to sustain them. I think it would have been possibly enough to keep one person alive. So that was the first account. I think it was the 22nd of December 1846, and as we progress into 1847 there's more and more accounts. So that was again one of the objectives of our work, was to just remind people, you know, of the horrors of the famine.
The road schemes began, we estimate, in November 1846. And by the time we get to January 1847, there's some 7,500 people across the county are working on the road schemes. And in the barony of Clonolly, we have 875 people working on some 17 road schemes. So we don't know for sure the exact number of people who were working on the road in Drumcurran, but we would know that they were coming from the local area, the Bow area, which is like an upland area in Fermanagh, and it was an area which was badly affected by the whole famine experience, to the point that when we get to the 1851 census, there's some 1/3 of the population has disappeared. What our archaeological excavation demonstrated was our road was never finished. The deck wasn't put on the road. There was no trace of any stone being brought to the site. They seem to have spent the £900 doing the enabling work and creating a clay platform on which the road would be set. We were very conscious in Queen's, Eileen and myself, that we wanted to do something to commemorate the 175th anniversary of the Great Famine. The Famine Roads, in our view, are testimony to what happened in Ireland during that terrible time, and yet they've been largely neglected. They're written about from maybe a historical point of view, they're known by locals on the landscape, but they really are a historic monument in their own right. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to highlight just how poignant they could be as historic monuments for the period. But it was a fitting ending to the programme that we had engaged in, that we have now got on the Sites and Monuments record a Famine Road.
We ended our excavation with an interdenominational service because it didn't matter whatever your religion was. If you were poor, you were very susceptible to death during the famine. So we had Sister Adele Bannon, Reverend Samson Aduka and Father Seamus Quinn, and they came out and oversaw our interdenominational service, and we had 70 members of the local community came together, and we had music, and our students read contemporary excerpts, about life in the famine at that time. And it was a really poignant service, and it really brought together the community, and I sort of felt it was a really fitting tribute to the people who died in the famine and who'd worked on that road. And like I say, it just reminds us of the catastrophe that the famine was, socially, culturally and economically. So our excavation at Drumacooran, it was very much a community affair. It involved volunteers and members of the local community, and the local community in Bow really did embrace the project, and they were very interested to find out more about the road and actually get involved in the excavation. So part of our work, we wanted to hear stories from them about the famine, and we heard some tales, about people eating grass and about accidents, people dying on the road, but they were very general. There was only one specific story really that came through about the road at Drumacooran, and that was recounted by local historian Sister Adele Bannon, and she grew up in the area, and she said that she remembers as a child, if they were in that area at night and they were going past the Famine Road, they would run because there was like a spooky, eerie atmosphere. So we wondered, was that a folk memory that was harkening back to the trauma of what happened at Drumacooran in the field on the road, because of all the suffering, that was somehow, instilled in the memories of the people of Bow.
Here we are looking down from the Healy Pass, formerly known as the Kerry Pass, on the approaching road up from the valleys. It's often known as the Irish Stelvio because it looks a bit like the Stelvio Pass in the Alps. And in a beautiful day like today, it is the finest place that you'll find on earth really. It's hard to believe that the foundations for this road were actually put in place by people destitute during the famine in the mid-1800s. And as part of a relief project, and the people had to come up here, starving as they were, and close to death, to toil and work 12-hour days to put the foundations in for this road you're seeing in front of you. And what's very interesting is that if you look at the maps from the 1840s, which were done by the Ordnance Survey, and we have an incredible resource in the Ordnance Survey showing pre-famine maps, 16 scale. It shows the whole lot of Ireland, and you can see actually before the famine if a road is in position or not. So the actual relief project was a continuation of that road over the saddle of the mountain and down the other side towards the north of the Beara Peninsula. And while it's incredible to stand here in a beautiful sunny day looking down the valley, it's always crucially important that we spare a thought for the lives lost and the souls and the destitute of the people that were involved in building these infrastructures. We are here today on a saddle in the Caha Mountains on the Beara Peninsula. And connectivity between the two parts of this peninsula was crucially important back the ages. From the south to the north, the only way you could go from one side to the other was either to go all around, which would have been like 50 miles, or try and cut through the mountains, which is about 8 miles. You had an ancient trail here, which is like a bridle path, which was called Balakskaha at the time, which meant the sheltered cave, which kind of tells the story itself. It meant that if you had bad weather here, there may have been some relief to get from sheltering in the caves locally. And it was always used as a physical link between the two communities, north and south of the peninsula. Then, during the famine times, when famine relief schemes were being introduced across the country to provide support and some bit of work for the local destitute community, this was chosen as one of those famine relief schemes. And the idea was to develop it from just a bridle track to a road that could be used by horses and carts at the time. It was a huge undertaking. Can you imagine cutting through the rock there with sledges and with just the most basic of equipment, having to come up here yourself from your local communities down the valleys, starving, destitute, expected to work 12-hour days to put this road into place. You can't imagine it, particularly on a beautiful sunny day like today. Unlike a lot of the other famine roads across the country, who are often referred to as roads starting nowhere and going nowhere, this one actually was completed as such, and it is still used to this day, which is crucially important that actually not all the infrastructure was to no avail. Some of it we are still benefiting from the labours of those misfortunes in the mid-1800s. Other examples, for instance, would be the coastal road in Antrim. And there's a very interesting description of that and a plaque on the actual road. It was put there by Lady Londonderry, and she basically explains that how the whole community were left down by the government at the time, and that's actually on the Antrim coast roads. Other examples would be, for instance, the digging out of the hills and the approaches to Fermoy, again used every day by local people. And even though we drive on these things, we may not be aware that they were actually, again, the projects were completed during the famine and we still use them. The actual seawall in Kilkee is another example of the same. And I think that in many respects they are famine monuments created by famine victims. So you're kind of travelling over hallowed ground really when you go to these locations. You might even be aware of it, you're just passing through here, which is the Healy Pass, and you wouldn't be aware at all possibly that this was actually a famine project. We're here in a townland of Grag in North Cork. And North Cork was one of the worst affected parts of Cork and indeed of the country. We're all very familiar with Connemara and with West Cork, but North Cork was very badly affected as well. And this particular townland of Grag, the landlord was an absentee landlord, so the poor misfortunate labourers who were living in 4th-class houses had no relief whatsoever when the famine struck and their potato crop was wiped out by the blight, as we all know. What we're walking on the moment is the actual famine relief road. This is one of thousands across the country. So the idea was that you had engineers coming along. They would more or less draw a line on a map from point A to point B, and there was very little surveying done. So regardless of what kind of terrain the actual road had to go through, that was for the people on the job to sort out. And the basic principle was that it was going to give relief. The secondary advantage is that it may be an infrastructural value further down the road, pardon the pun. This one now in particular, this is actually, as you can see, is a road structure, and the road will be between about 12 feet and about 30, depending on the needs, with a drain and a ditch at both sides, as you can see here. The foundation of the road was to be about 6 inches of crushed stone. Now, of course, the stone was crushed by the actual labourers themselves. And what you would have is that you would have whole families coming to work on the relief. These would be destitute, starving people now. Basically, there were oftentimes roads starting nowhere and going nowhere. They were paid between 8 and about 10 pence for their day's work. However, you would have to start at 6 o'clock in the morning and finish at 6 o'clock in the evening. So it was a 12-hour day. If you started after 6 o'clock, between 6 and 9, you only got half a day's pay, and if you arrived at the works after 9 o'clock, you didn't get paid at all. What you have here in the background, this would be a very typical now post-famine scene where you would have actually people living in 4-class accommodation. Now, 4-class accommodation, just to give you an idea of it, is a mud cabin built of organic material with just a door, no windows, no solid walls, no solid roof. Almost a third or over a third of the population were living in these mud hovels. Over 500,000 families in total, at least 500,000. So if you're living in this environment, which today is a fine day, but normally it is wet and damp, it's totally unsuitable for this type of a construction, because the one thing that a mud hut needs is that it needs to be kept dry and warm, or else it starts collapsing in on itself. And of course, if you and your family are beginning to starve, you lose the ability to be able to go out, collect firewood, collect brambles, collect furze to make a little fire to keep your little cabin warm. So you had a double problem then, because you weren't able to keep it warm, it wasn't kept dry, dampness came in, the rain came in through the roof, and the whole thing collapsed in on top of the family that were living inside it. Here we are on another relief road in the townland of Inclement. This would be north of the River Bride in North Cork as well, similar to the other townland of Grag, but this is within the same civil parish of Arnageha. This is the second relief road in the small area, only about 2 miles from the last one. And this road, again, the idea was that it would follow the river line and create a more direct route from East Cork to West Cork. And as you can see by the rock here, the rock face was actually cut by hand by the labourers during the famine to make the actual road. It was never fully completed. It stops down there about half a mile down where we're standing now in a private field. The rock here was actually cut by hand by the labourers as part of the works. This whole valley went all the way down to the river. So they actually had to chisel out a ledge out of the sheer rock to make a platform for the actual road bed itself. And then of course they were able to use the rock that they chiseled here to actually construct a wall at the riverside to support the actual road from falling into the river. And you can actually see this wall to this day, and you can see a culvert that they actually created for the water to flow under the road where we're standing here. If I stand alongside it, it must be over 20 foot high of solid rock that they had to cut out. All the ways down along, down probably in this section, probably a quarter of a mile of solid rock that had to be cut by hand. So when they'd come here on the day, they had to actually work 12 hours a day from 6 in the morning, doing work like cutting that kind of a rock there, and you're starving at the same time. Countless people actually died on this particular stretch of the relief road, and they are buried above in Duns Peter as well, which is just across the river up about a half a mile from here. It's a very important part of our national and local heritage, and as you can see, it's a famine and national monument, but built by the actual victims themselves of the famine.
So the burn is more widely known for its other monuments such as dolmens, ring forts and wedge tombs. There's high concentration of those monuments in the burn because there was, first of all, such readily available stone, and people in generations later didn't have to reuse the stone to build more modern structures because there was so much already available. The Famine Road is also a monument of more modern times. We would have played on this road as children. I grew up near here, and we used to make up stories of people buried in the road, which was fanciful at the time, but looking back there probably was some truth in it, and there was definitely places on it which felt a little haunted. County Clare was one of the worst affected counties by the famine because the burn was seen as not such valuable land, so a lot of the poor Irish were already living here. There's a report that the population density in the Burn lowlands at the time was 400 people per square mile, which is hard to imagine these days when you think of how quiet and peaceful it is. It would have been a very different place back then. And you'll often find in corners of the Burn famine ruins of little villages and houses and sheds where people once lived. So the formation of the Burn limestone and therefore the rocks on the road, about 350 million years ago, Ireland was somewhere just south of the equator. And this whole area would have been under a shallow tropical sea. So all the stone here is limestone, and that is formed from the remains of sea creatures at that time and calcium carbonate from the water being compressed over time, over millions of years, into rock. So in the stone, even along the road here, we can find fossils of corals and creatures like brachiopods and gastropods, and they would have been the relatives of modern snails and oysters. So you can see here as well on Slieve Rua, the hill behind me, so there's layers and layers here of limestone, and they were formed over millions of years. The layers are explained by the fact that the sea level at the time would have been rising and falling, and the beds of limestone reflect those different sea levels. So the limestone pavement above the Famine Road here behind me hides many botanical surprises, and botanists from all over the world will come to study the unique flora here. 75% of Ireland's wild floral species are found in the burn, and it's famous for having a unique combination of flora. So you have alpine flowers and Mediterranean plants growing beside each other, and then you'll also find acid-loving plants growing next to alkaline-loving plants. So the bloody cranesbill would be a typical Mediterranean plant, and we often see that growing next to mountain avens, which are an alpine plant. Just above the Famine Road, which is behind me here, we have this lesser-known structure or monument. This is known as a turf tile. So back pre-famine times and during the famine, the burn was even less forested than it is today, if you can believe that. Most of the hazelwoods had been cleared for building and firewood. So in order to get fuel for the fire, they built these structures. They're a U-shaped wall. They would have been covered with flat stones, and they filled them with animal dung. And the wind blowing through the holes in the wall here would have dried the dung, and they would then have used it for fuel for the fire. Fuel for the fire for warmth, for light, and for cooking. There's wild animals here such as hare and feral goats, and I like to imagine them cooking them over the fire using the wild herbs that grow here, such as wild marjoram, wild thyme, and maybe even the wood sage.
I'm standing on the beautiful slopes of Slieve Gullion in the barony of Upper Orier. I'm standing in the parish of Killeavy in the townland of Drummondtee. And behind me there's a stone wall, and that stone wall divides this townland of Drummondtee with the townland of Anahaya behind me. The wall results from the 1846-1847 winter during the Great Famine. The wall behind me in folklore, in the folk memory, is a famine wall. But when you look at the presentment records, there are no mentions in the barony of Upper Orier of famine walls. If we look at the landscape, we can see that there's no difficulty finding the raw material for these walls, because the soil is boulder clay, glacial till, and in the field over my shoulder there are many, many boulders still there despite the building of the wall. The wall was used to try and relieve destitution. Come here to the slopes of Slieve Gullion in the townland of Drummondtee beside the famine wall for the scenery, but also to engage with that folk memory.
It has sometimes seemed to me as if every great event, especially if it be of the more tragic order, ought to have some distinctive cairn or monument of its own. Some spot at which one could stand, as before a shrine, there to meditate upon it, and upon it alone. Such a shrine, though only in my own eminently private mental chapel, the great Irish famine of 1846 to 1847 possesses, and has possessed for more years than I can readily reckon. Whenever I think of it, there rises before me one particular spot, in one particular corner of Connemara, one particular cluster of cabins, or rather wrecks of cabins. For roofs, there have been none since I knew it first. There they stand, these poor cabins, perishing memorials, and yearly the nettle spread a little further across their hearthstones, and yearly the slope on which they rest crumbles a little nearer to the sea, and yearly the rain batters them a little more down, and the green things cluster more closely around them. And so it will be till one day the walls too will roll over, and the bog from above will overtake them, and the last trace of what was once a populous village will have disappeared, without so much as a "here lies" to say where it stood. Leaving the village of Lenan, it stands, as you're probably aware, upon the south shore of the Greater Killary. You keep straight on till you come to a certain white gate on the right-hand side of the road. You will find yourself upon a grass-grown roadway with the shining level of the fjord below, and above a steep incline of bog cutting across the sky, a sky which may be friendly at one moment or may be threatening, and pass across a long stretch of bog, up one incline and down another, over a stream, and now we have reached the point for which we set out. We have arrived at our ruined village. We are standing upon the Famine Road. Certain words and certain combinations of words seem to need an eminently local education in order to adequately appreciate them. These two words, Famine Road, are amongst that number. To other larger minds than ours, they're probably without any particular meaning or inwardness. But to the home-staying Irish man or Irish woman, they mean only too much.